climate change?
That's a great question, Dua. Hi, my name is Niranjali Amerasinghe, and I'm going to talk to you today about climate change. So climate change, in its simplest terms, refers to changes in average conditions in our planet. Things like temperature, rainfall, sea levels. When those average conditions start to change, we will say that the climate is changing. Today, when we talk about climate change, we are talking about climate change as a result of global warming. Now, global warming is the increase in average temperatures globally over a period of time that scientists have been measuring temperature in our planet. And the reason that it's getting hotter is that there are these things called heat-trapping gases or greenhouse gases. So you may have heard of something called the greenhouse gas effect. And that is where these heat-trapping gases, carbon dioxide and methane are two that most people are familiar with, will cause the air to get warmer. Now, in a greenhouse, in a balanced environment, the carbon dioxide that is cycling through that system will keep the greenhouse warm enough that you can grow things even if the temperature outside is cold. But if you put too much carbon dioxide into that system, then it can overheat, right? It can get too hot to sustain that ecosystem. And that is what we are seeing in our planet, where there is too much carbon dioxide, too much methane and other greenhouse gases that are in our planet, that it is causing temperatures to get warmer and warmer. And we have observed this rise in temperature, and scientists are projecting that if we continue to put carbon dioxide and methane into the air as we are doing, then temperatures will only rise. The main ways that there are many ways that we put heat-trapping gases into the air, but the main ways tend to be when we burn fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, and gas, and also when we grow livestock. Their bodily functions, their digestive systems will produce gas that has methane in it. And if you grow enough animals over a long enough period of time, then those methane emissions can also contribute to global warming. You had another question, Annabelle.
How does global warming affect the climate?
Okay, so there are a number of ways in which rising temperatures can affect the climate. I'm going to talk about just a few of them. The one that perhaps comes to mind immediately when you think about things becoming hotter is just think about an area that has a reasonable temperature. You can grow a lot of food there. If it gets hotter and hotter and hotter and it stays hot, you might have some cool days, you might have a little bit of rain, but overall it's getting hotter and hotter. So you've gone from average temperatures of 33 degrees Celsius to 42 degrees Celsius over periods of time. You might see that ecosystem change. You might see that area change such that you can't grow things anymore. The soil might become really dry, and it might not be possible to grow anymore. That's a really easy example for people to wrap their heads around. But there are other things too. There are ways in which global warming will affect our weather patterns and make things a lot less predictable. So we're used to growing seasons. We're used to rain falling at a particular time for a particular period of time, and then we have a period without rain. But when global warming comes into the picture, it can change that dramatically. So in Sri Lanka, for example, sometimes we have observed 6 months worth of rainfall, what you would have seen normally over 6 months taking place in 1 month. And that has two major problems, right? One is that you're getting a lot of rainfall in a concentrated period of time. So then you've got farmers and people in that area dealing with flooding, with landslides maybe, and that's a challenge. The other is that then for the next 5 months, you don't see any rain, which significantly affects our ability to grow food. You might also see changes in weather in the form of very intense storms. And this is something that we're hearing about all over the world, where storms are becoming more and more intense. And it's causing a lot of damage for people. You may have heard about the California and the Australia wildfires. And there are many reasons why wildfires will happen, but if you add global warming into that picture and it's getting hotter and drier in those areas, then a wildfire that might have been a smaller, more contained wildfire that in some places helps keep the ecosystem balance gets completely out of whack and much bigger than we can contain. So these are some of the ways in which global warming can affect the climate. But there's one other thing that I want to show you, and I'm going to use an experiment to show you, and that is the impact of global warming on our oceans. So to do this, let's see. First, I'm going to put on my safety goggles, and I'm going to show you the difference in something called heat capacity between air and water, so that it's a little bit clearer how the oceans come into this picture, or the oceans or large bodies of water that we have. Okay, so over here, I've got a water balloon. I've got a balloon filled with water, and I've got a balloon filled with air. Now, watch what happens to the balloon filled with water when you hold it against the flame. It's holding, right? It's not bursting right away. And that's because the water is absorbing the heat right now, and it's keeping the surface of the rubber cool. So for right now, the rubber isn't absorbing that heat as much as it could in another situation. Okay, now look what happens. Thank you, Annabelle. Now look what happens when I bring in a balloon filled with air and get it closer to the flame. It burst. Right? So the reason I wanted to show you that is because our oceans and large bodies of water absorb heat. And when they absorb heat, there are all sorts of impacts that will take place. When water absorbs heat, when it gets hotter, it expands. So we see sea levels rising. We also know that our oceans are connected to our polar ice caps at the north of the world and the southern parts of the world. And when they start to melt, not only does it increase sea levels, it also means that the white sheets of ice that will reflect sunlight and help in keeping temperatures down are also gone. The Arctic has lost a considerable amount of its sea ice over the summer because it's getting too warm, surface temperatures and oceans getting warmer. Oceans getting warmer will also significantly affect marine life and ecosystems. And it also absorbs carbon dioxide, which means that the ocean is getting more and more acidic. And that becomes a challenge for marine ecosystems as well. Okay, you had another question.
So what do we do about climate change?
Right. What are the solutions? So there are two main ways that we will think about addressing climate change. One is that we have to do everything we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the reason that global warming is happening, we have to do something about that as quickly as we possibly can. And that is called mitigation. The other aspect is that there is already temperature increase that is locked into our climate system. And that is already resulting in catastrophic impacts for many people around the world. Sea levels rising has caused coastal erosion. More intense storm systems have been devastating for many people who have faced those impacts. Farmers are struggling with these changing weather patterns and drought and all of the challenges that come with dealing with those impacts, the loss of their livelihoods. So we also have to do everything we can to help vulnerable communities adapt to climate change. And that is called adaptation. With adaptation, one of the things to keep in mind is that it's often poorer and more marginalized people who are the most vulnerable to impacts. And think about fishermen and local communities who are living right on the coastline, who with sea level rise are going to see their livelihoods taken away and their homes taken away, right? And doing what we can to ensure those communities can adapt to avoid coastal erosion, whatever that looks like, right? We have to come up with solutions for them. So with mitigation, I want to talk about a couple of sectors. There's a lot of different ways in which we can reduce emissions, but there's one or two that I want to focus on. One is our energy system. For the most part, our energy system is based on burning fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas, in order to produce energy. It's those same fuels that we will often put into cars as a fuel source in order for them to work. So we need to change our energy systems as quickly as we can to renewable sources like solar and wind, wave technology, and small-scale hydro where we can. And we have to make that transition quickly but fairly, because there are people who have jobs in these industries. There are people who cannot afford the transition to a solar panel on their roof, or to pay more for renewable sources of energy. So governments do have to do everything they can to make sure that the transition is fair. The other sector I want to talk about is land and how we use our land. Because as a species, we have been cutting down rainforests and building over wetlands and a whole range of ecosystems that have helped keep our planet in balance. Think about trees, right? They absorb carbon dioxide. They're the Earth's natural system for keeping temperatures reasonable. They're the Earth's lungs. They help clean our air. And when we cut them down to make way for other things, we are putting our planet at jeopardy, both for biodiversity loss, but also climate change that is significantly impacting people in turn. So we have to think about our forest conservation, wetland conservation. Wetlands can help with managing floods, for example, and how to do that while also developing. And we call this sustainable development, right? Or climate compatible development. How do we do it? And governments need to think about how to strike that balance. The other aspect of this is where the agriculture sector comes in, and often in the agricultural sector, we'll see that in order to make way for livestock and for farming, people cut down forests, and there's got to be a balance there too. But the other angle of this is that, I mentioned before, the digestive systems of animals, when you're growing them at large scale, the methane emissions from those animals have a huge impact on our climate. So we also have to rethink our consumption patterns so that we're eating more sustainably, right? And allowing our agricultural systems to be less industrial and to evolve into more sustainable ways of farming. All right, last question, Annabelle.
What can you and I do about climate change?
Right. So much of the responsibility for addressing climate change rests with governments, because these are big systems changes that we need to see addressed. And certainly not all governments are responsible in the same way. The United States, being the world's largest historical emitter, absolutely has to do more. And that's something that I work on, is trying to push the US government to do its fair share in addressing climate change. And making sure that it mitigates, but also provides finance for poorer countries that are trying to deal with climate change as well. But in terms of our own individual responsibility, number one, I would say, is talk to your decision makers. Talk to people at local and national and international levels to make your thoughts about climate change aware. Make them aware of your thoughts on climate change and what you want to see changed. But other things are, if you can, put a solar panel on your roof. If you can, switch to an electric vehicle. If you can, if it's safe, cycle. Eat less meat. Change your dietary patterns so that you are starting to affect the consumption patterns and the demand that you're creating in the market. If you have the time or the money, support efforts to help communities that are struggling right now adapt to climate change. Those are just a handful of things. So I'll stop there, but I'll leave you with the fact that climate change is serious and dramatic. We are going to see dramatic changes to our ecosystem if we don't take urgent action to address climate change. The good news is that there are lots of things we can do, and we have to push governments to do them. But I believe that collectively we definitely can make a difference and both mitigate climate change and help people adapt to climate change in meaningful ways. All right. Thank you for listening to me. Connect with me on Facebook if you want to learn more. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. Bye.
Bye. Merry Christmas.